Hello everyone, and welcome to Lesson 5 in Unit 3, Area Study 3, which is Australia and the World Economy, or Australia and the International Economy, as I should have updated it to. I'm now realizing 5 lessons in basically means the same thing though, so who really cares? This is going to be a little bit different to if you've been watching the videos on the old study design, which I recommend not doing because this is newer, it's more up to date, it's more current. Lesson 5 is totally different to what it used to be. So it used to be about free trade and protectionism. Now it is specifically about international competitiveness, the factors that impact international competitiveness, and how changes in international competitiveness will affect the 3 domestic macroeconomic goals as well as living standards. So key knowledge that we're getting into today is international competitiveness and the factors that may affect international competitiveness. So things like productivity, production costs, availability of natural resources, exchange rates, and relative rates of inflation. For each of them, we're going to kind of be talking about generally what that factor means, and then more specifically, what that factor means in Australia. And then we're also going to briefly talk about the movements of changes in international competitiveness on the domestic macroeconomic goals and living standards. So basically just how changes in international competitiveness will impact each of the 3 goals, and in general, how that may impact living standards. So learning intention, as it has been all along, is to understand how global transactions impact living standards in Australia. Our success criteria is that you can describe what international competitiveness is, as well as you can explain how changes in international competitiveness will impact the 3 domestic macroeconomic goals and living standards. So to get straight into it, what is international competitiveness? So international competitiveness refers to how effective a country is able to be in different global markets. So our international competitiveness will vary based on the industry, market, product, good service, etc. It's going to vary in all different industries. Australia is very competitive in different industries for different reasons. And we're going to go through the factors and talk about some where Australia is really effective and some where we're less effective. So it can be impacted by how efficiently a country is able to produce, as well as the areas of competitive advantage that country has. So historically, Australia's had a massive competitive advantage in commodities exports, as we are a relatively young country with a wealth of natural resources that we've been able to export. And we'll talk about that more a little bit in future slides. But more recently, Australia's realized we've got a competitive advantage in areas of service. So things like health and education, we've been able to export that because we're seen as being quite competitive in that field in terms of price and quality. So some of the factors that impact international competitiveness. So the first one is productivity. In economics, productivity refers to the level of output a country is able to gain per level of input, or for every unit of input, how much output you get for that. Australia through the 90s and early 2000s had a massive boom in productivity, but that has stagnated a little bit over the last decade. So that's one thing that impacts our international competitiveness, is how much we're able to increase our productivity compared to other nations. And so because recently it has slowed, it did increase significantly during COVID and lockdowns. As people were working from home, businesses had less overhead costs and therefore were able to get more output per input. But there are many other countries that are far more productive than us because they have lower production costs that go into their production. So production costs can greatly affect productivity. And this refers to all the expenses involved in producing a good or service. So in Australia, we often struggle to compete internationally because we've got an incredibly high minimum wage compared to the rest of the world. So because of that high minimum wage, it means that we're unable to produce as well, because for every bit of output that we create, there's so much more costs that go into that. And therefore we struggle to compete with like Asian nations where labor is paid very little comparatively. And therefore you can produce much cheaper there and keep your production costs low and be more competitive internationally. So our next factor, which impacts our international competitiveness, is our availability of natural resources. So Australia has been really, really lucky over the past, century, essentially, that we've been able to rely on our abundance of natural resources. So our exports of commodities such as iron ore and coal have remained incredibly competitive for many, many years. We export a lot of iron ore to China, and one of the really positive things about it is because we have one of the greatest stores of it in the world, and it's relatively inelastic in demand. So even as the price has risen, it still remained competitive because these countries seriously need it, and that has really positively impacted our international competitiveness. Moving on to exchange rates. the value of the Australian dollar can greatly impact how internationally competitive we are. And there's a little bit of complexity to this part of it. So when there's an appreciation of the exchange rate, it means that our exports become more expensive to our trading partners. And that is going to decrease our competitiveness. However, in Australia, we use a lot of imports as inputs in production. And if there's an appreciation of the exchange rate, this can actually be favorable for aggregate supply, as it means we're going to have cheaper imports, and therefore it's going to lower our cost of production and make us more internationally competitive from a supply side. The demand side is always going to have a greater effect because it's going to have a larger impact overall on demand overall, but that lower cost of production is going to have a great impact also as we rely on a lot of imports as our inputs in production. But also, if there's a depreciation in the exchange rate, the opposite is true. It's going to make us more internationally competitive as our exports become cheaper internationally, but it also means that imported inputs become more expensive, and therefore that's going to rise production costs and make us less internationally competitive in terms of production. Our last factor that impacts international competitiveness is relative rates of inflation. So with relative rates of inflation, it's really, really important that you don't get your wires crossed when talking about questions that have the word relative rates in it. So relative rates is all about what the rate is in Australia compared to overseas. This is going to come up in other parts of economics with relative interest rates and a few other like relative wage growth, etc. Anything that's relative, it's us compared to overseas. And what we care about with inflation is if our inflation rate is lower than overseas countries. Because if our inflation rate is lower, it's going to mean that we're more competitive because prices are rising at a slower rate here compared to overseas. So if inflation is relatively lower than overseas trading partners, it's going to make us more competitive. So what we're going to go into now is how international competitiveness impacts our domestic macroeconomic goals. So first up with the goal of low inflation, which is for the general level of prices to be rising at a rate of 2 to 3% on average over time. If we become more competitive, it means that we're likely to be producing more output per unit of input, which can lower cost inflationary pressures and therefore make it more likely that the goal is going to be achieved. Especially because at the moment with inflation, we're trying to bring inflation down. It's currently 6.9% after the October monthly inflation CPI measurements. Therefore, we're trying to get it back down to that 2 to 3% on average over time rate. However, if we're able to produce at a lower cost, it can create increased demand for our exports and increased demand inflationary pressures. And that's going to make it less likely that the goal is going to be achieved. With the goal of strong and sustainable economic growth, if we become more internationally competitive, our exports should become more attractive to our trading partners and therefore increase overall aggregate demand. If aggregate demand increases, this sends a signal to producers to increase their overall production, and therefore that should increase economic growth. With the goal of full employment, it's relatively the same. So once the signal is sent to producers to increase production, this increases the derived demand for labor, which should decrease cyclical unemployment. However, on the downside for unemployment, if businesses increase their competitiveness by implementing new technology, it may lead to increases in structural unemployment as they're able to become more productive while using less labor to lower their production costs. Then lastly, how changes in international competitiveness impacts our living standards. So if increased international competitiveness leads to decreased unemployment, there should be higher average incomes and therefore increased material living standards. This increase in income should also mean that households are less stressed about their future financial security and therefore increase our non-material living standards. There are a few extra wrinkles here. There are many different ways you could talk about living standards here. If we increase our international competitiveness, we may actually start using our resources too quickly as we are exporting more to overseas, and therefore we may do more damage to the environment and decrease non-material living standards. There's many, many different ways you can talk about it, as long as you can justify it specifically to material or non-material living standards. All right, so that's it for the final lesson of Unit 3, Area Study 3. You are done with Unit 3 other than clear your assessment, but if you have any questions at all, feel free to leave a comment below or email me, sean@therunningeconomy.com. Good luck for all of your SACs at the end of this topic. It is one topic where students find it the most difficult of any. And I will see you next for Unit 4, where we're going to start out with monetary policy, which has changed a lot in this new study design. Have a wonderful day, and I'll see you next time. Goodbye.